Okay, we've looked at the relationship between gender and crime. We've looked at the relationship between age and crime. And we've deconstructed the relationship between race and crime. There's one other interesting aspect of the demography of crime that we need to look at. And it was uncovered by three criminologists, Marvin Wolfgang, Robert Figlio, and Thorsten Selin. And they wrote about this finding in their book, Delinquency in a Birth Cohort. And this is a classic book. It's old. But the thing that they found is one of the most essential concepts in criminology. And what Wolfgang, Figlio, and Selin did was they looked at a cohort of 10,000 kids in Philadelphia between the ages of 10 and 18. This was in 1945. And they looked at many different aspects of these kids' lives. And one of the things that they looked at was contact with the police. How many run-ins with the law did these kids have? And if you look at the table, you'll see exactly what it is that they found. They found that 65% of the cohort, 2/3 of the kids, had no run-ins with the law. They had no contact with the police at all. So 2/3 living a completely crime-free life, or at least no contacts with the police. And then about 16% of the cohort had just one brush with the law. And that constituted 16% of the cohort and 16% of the police contacts. So you have a group of kids who sort of had one brush with the law, and that's it. Maybe shoplifting one time, maybe drunk in public one time, whatever. Then, as you progress in police contacts, you see something interesting happen here. Wolfgang, Figlio, and Selin called non-chronic offenders kids that had had between 2 and 4 contacts with the law. And these kids were 12.4% of the cohort, but they accounted for 1/3 of all of the police contacts. And so that's about not quite 3 times their share. So if they're 12% of the cohort, you would expect them to have 12% of the police contacts if they committed their share of the crime, but really they committed 3 times their expected share of the crime. But that's nothing compared to those that had 5 or more police contacts. And Wolfgang, Figlio, and Selin labeled these people chronic offenders. And the chronic offenders were 6% of the kids, but they accounted for half of all the police contacts. 6% account for half of all the crime. And that's pretty staggering. And what's even more staggering is that the worse the crime, the greater the involvement. Together, this 6% accounted for 71% of the homicides, 73% of the rapes, 82% of the robberies, and 69% of the aggravated assaults. That's a pretty interesting finding, this notion that in their cohort, it is a small percentage of the people who commit a large percentage of the crime. And guess what? That finding has been replicated over and over and over again in study after study, in location after location, time after time. And that's why these people are called the chronic 6%. Sometimes it's called the sinister 7%. And it's not always 6%. It's not always 7%. But what you find in virtually all large studies with enough people to make for stable statistics is that a small percentage of the people in any given group commit a large percentage of the crime. That's even true in prison. In large prisons, what you find is that a small number of the inmates commit a large percentage of the inmate infractions. And so what this means is that even in high crime areas, even in neighborhoods that are notorious for crime, most people in those neighborhoods are law-abiding. And by law-abiding, I mean don't engage in the kinds of crimes that we're afraid of, like robberies and murders and things like that. And of course, the chronic 6%, or the idea of these chronic offenders, has interesting policy implications. If we can predict who is going to be a chronic offender before they become a chronic offender, then we can incapacitate these people. We can put them in prison, keep them in prison, so that we can save society a lot of grief, right? Remember, we talked about how most people age out of crime. They stop committing crimes as they get older. But what about these high-rate offenders that are particularly dangerous, that are much more likely to be recidivists? Criminologists want to know if we can identify them beforehand so that we can save society the trouble. And so, can we do it? Are there characteristics of the chronic 6% that will allow us to identify them beforehand? Well, what you see is that chronic offenders do tend to have some characteristics that set them apart from other people. The first is they tend to start early. That is to say, they are engaged in delinquent activity when they're little kids. They're second or third graders that are in trouble for fighting on the playground. They're kids that are defiant with their teachers, even while they're very young. They tend to come from lower income families. They tend to have siblings and parents that are involved in crime. So the delinquency is something that is surrounding them in their home. They're unspecialized in that they're not, they don't have a particular type of crime that they're engaged in. It's not like professional car thieves or professional pickpockets. These are people that will steal whatever isn't nailed down, or they will lash out if they're annoyed, or they'll take whatever kind of drug that's handed to them. They're not really particular about the kind of antisocial behavior that they engage in. This idea of analogous behaviors is other risk-taking behaviors that might not be illegal but have some of the same characteristics of crime. Gambling, engaging in risky behavior, drinking, driving your car like a maniac, things like that. And then chronic offenders tend to have lots of mental problems. Difficulty with school is a hallmark of chronic offenders. So low IQs, low tested IQs, attention deficit disorder, these kinds of things are common among chronic offenders. And of course, atypical empathic responses are kids who just don't have much of a conscience, that don't feel guilty. Now, the problem is these might be the characteristics of chronic offenders, but not all chronic offenders have all of these things, or even most of these things. And some kids that have most of these things, or maybe even all of these things, don't go on to be chronic offenders. So this is what philosophers call the dualistic fallacy. Not everybody that has these things is a chronic offender, and not every chronic offender has these things. And so at the present time, there isn't any way to predict in advance who is going to be a chronic offender. We might recognize people who are at greater risk of being chronic offenders, but there isn't any way at this point to justify keeping this kid in prison longer or letting this kid go, because you're going to have false negatives, kids that you didn't think were chronic offenders that turned out to be chronic offenders, and you're going to have false positives, kids that you put in prison and believed were high risk, that were going to age out of crime like anybody else. Now, one of the things that we see from this list is that this list is very consistent with people who have sort of problems with their brain. And so, for instance, if you look at criminal siblings and criminal parents, neuroscientists and biopsychologists would say, well, That's because they have some sort of genetic anomaly or some hereditary disorder that was passed down from the parents and that was also present in the siblings. And so all of the things on this list are consistent with genetic or hereditary problems, but they're also consistent with environmental problems. So, for instance, you could say the reason someone has a criminal brother or sister and criminal parents might not be hereditary. It might be a similar environment, that you learn criminal behavior from your siblings and your parents, that you observe it and you model it, and that's the relationship. So this is a point of departure for sociologists and neuroscientists and biopsychologists, this idea of whether it is heredity or environment. And very early on, there were important criminologists who began to investigate this link, and many of them believed that the best way to explain these chronic offenders was by looking at biology. So one of the figures that we're going to talk about is our old friend Lombroso, who we learned about in a previous lecture. And Lombroso was a physician at an Italian prison. And Lombroso observed the incarcerated offenders, and he did autopsies on prisoners when they died. And he observed that these prisoners were bigger boned than the average person, and that they had heavier brow ridges than the average person, and that they had larger canines than the average person, and that they had thicker jaws and skulls. And what he concluded was that maybe criminals were some sort of throwback to an earlier evolutionary stage. So Darwin had already written The Origin of the Species, and people were thinking a lot about biological evolution and how human beings may have evolved from primates. And so what Lombroso thought is that maybe this sort of evolution of the species took place within the womb as well, because a human embryo starts off as a small single-celled organism, and then there's a certain point where the embryo looks a little bit like a fish, and then it looks a little bit like any nondescript mammal, and it slowly sort of goes through this evolutionary development in the womb. And what Lombroso thought is that maybe some babies are born that aren't completely cooked. They don't come out at the Homo sapiens stage. They come out at the Neanderthal stage, and that these are sort of caveman babies. And that's what explains why they're criminals, and it's what explains why they look like they look. Those heavy brow ridges are like a Neanderthal's skull, and those big canines are to rip raw meat. And Lombroso said that criminals are less sensitive to pain. And what's the proof of that? Because they're covered with tattoos, and they're like the classic Neanderthals. And so Lombroso called these things atavistic anomalies. And he argued that this is why we have crime in enlightened society, because criminals are defective. They are broken humans. They were born as evolutionary throwbacks to a savage stage. And of course, how would Lombroso deal with the crime problem if that's the case? Well, you're sort of guilty until proven innocent. If you have those characteristics, you're to be identified beforehand and sterilized at best. And the eugenics was the solution. Now, if you think that sounds ridiculous, it is ridiculous. Some of the things that these 19th century people thought are absurd by our standards today. No one believes in this sort of caveman theory these days. There was no control group in Lombroso's observations. There was, no scientific methodology. No credible criminologist buys this today. But what happened, as is often the case with these funky 19th century ideas, is that Lombroso started a conversation. People sort of picked up the idea of hereditary problems and abandoned the idea of observable physical characteristics, but sort of argue, well, what if there are some sort of things that are lurking in the genes? So there was a social scientist by the name of Richard Dugdale, and he studied a sort of a New York hillbilly family from the Adirondacks called the Jukes, and that was the name of his book, The Jukes. And they were this mountain family. He looked at them for 3 generations. They all had criminal histories. They had menial jobs when they were working. They had poor work ethic. They were in and out of jail. They abused alcohol. They were, according to Dugdale, feeble-minded, low IQ. And he just argued that they were defective people because you have 3 generations of defective people. Baby Juke is defective, Daddy Juke is defective, and Grandpa Juke is defective. It stands to reason that these are defective genes, defective people, and these defects are passed on from parent to child. Now, of course, criminologists would say, hang on a second. If they inhabited the same kind of crimogenic environment, for instance, if they lived in poverty, and if they had no opportunity, if they were not educated, it could very well be that these environments are crimogenic, that what causes the crime is not the people, but the place, that the type of environment. And if you have 3 generations in this environment, then you might have 3 generations of criminals because you have 3 generations living in a crimogenic situation. So we know that criminal parents are more likely to have criminal children than our non-criminal parents. But how do you tease out the difference between heredity and environment? How can you tell the difference between what's caused by the environment and what's caused by the genes? I mean, one thing we know for sure is that environment matters because crime varies from time to time and place to place. I mean, we talked about how crime rates have dramatically declined over the past 20 years. It's not like there were fewer defective people born or defective people suddenly died off or something like that. So we know that the environment matters. How do you hold the environment constant? How can we determine what is due to environment and what is due to genes? So a common way to solve this problem is to look at adopted children, because adopted children have biological parents, and that's where they get their genes, and they have their adoptive parents. And if they grow up in the home with adoptive parents, that's their environment. So when you look at the behavior of adopted kids, if environment is more important, you would expect them to behave more like their adoptive parents. And if genes are more important, you would expect them to behave more like their biological parents. Now in Denmark, they have a huge registry of adopted children. And so they are able to do massive studies with huge numbers of participants to look at the difference between adoptive children's behavior and their parents' behavior. And one of the things that they've done is they've looked to see whether or not the criminal behavior of adopted children is more like the behavior of their adoptive parents or more like their biological parents. And what they've discovered is that generally it is the case that adopted children, with respect to their criminal behavior, are more like their biological parents than they are their adoptive parents. And so people have said, that must be the result of heredity. Sociologists aren't quite so sure, because adoption itself can be kind of stressful. I'm sure it's traumatic for kids to find out that they're adopted, or children might have emotional problems or difficulties when they ponder the fact that they don't live with their real parents. And who are their real parents? One of the things that makes it easy for me to interact with my son is that because some aspects of personality are heritable. some aspects of the way that we think do come down through the genes. And so a lot of times I will see my son behave at age 13 the way I behaved at age 13, and that gives me insights in how to parent him. Because I think to myself, well, this is what would have worked, or this is what I was thinking when I was his age. If I'm an adopted father, as hard as I try, it might be more difficult. So you really can't control for environment there, because there are confounding factors, sociologists would say. That there is a particular type of stress that's associated with adoption. That's why adopted children are more at risk of delinquency than children who live with both of their biological parents. And so sociologists would say, you really haven't controlled for the environment there. So is there something else that you can do? So what social scientists have done is to look at twins. Because twins that are reared in the same household have about as close to the same environment as they can possibly get. And there are two types of twins. There are monozygotic twins, or identical twins, and that's where one sperm fertilizes one egg, and that egg splits mitotically into two people. So identical twins are clones of each other. They have the same exact DNA. So you are holding the environment constant because they're raised together, and you're holding genetics constant because they have the same DNA. Fraternal twins are when two eggs are fertilized by two sperm. And so fraternal twins are no more related to each other than are any two siblings. A person is no more related to their fraternal twin than they are to their older brother or their older sister. And that's why you can have fraternal twins where one is male and the other is female. So there you have the environment held constant because they're raised together, but they're genetically different. So the idea is that when you look at the behavior of one twin, the degree to which the behavior of the other twin matches should be higher among monozygotic twins than it is among dizygotic twins if genetics matter. So in social science, they call this a concordance rate. The extent to which twin A's behavior is the same or similar to twin B's behavior. When A and B behave alike, that's concordance. And what we see is that in twin studies, among identical twins, there's concordance in 60% of the twin pairs. So when twin A is delinquent, 60% of the time twin B is delinquent. For fraternal twins, the concordance rate is only 30%. So you see twice as much concordance among identical twins as you do among fraternal twins. 60% of the time for identical twins versus 30% of the time for fraternal twins. So that would seem to be fairly solid evidence that there are some things that are in the genes that do act as risk factors that put people at risk of certain behaviors that are illegal. Now, that doesn't mean that the genes tell the whole story. Remember, the concordance rate is 60%. Well, what would it be if the environment didn't matter at all? Well, of course, it would be 100%, but it's not 100%. Among the fraternal twins, the concordance rate was 30%, which means that 70% would be explained by the environment. So these twin studies are significant enough that most neuroscientists, most biopsychologists, and a lot of sociologists like me are like, not so sure we can completely and totally rule biology out in every instance. And some of these things have some interesting ideas. So what kinds of things have been implicated that could be biological? The reading goes over some of them, and some of them we've talked about. For instance, we've talked about testosterone, that testosterone levels are hereditary and is a risk factor. Things like IQ have a hereditary component, and having a low IQ is pretty strongly correlated with the commission of crime. And there are various reasons for why that might be the case. Some people say that IQ has a direct effect on criminal activity because low IQ people are easily influenced, or low IQ people have a problem assessing risk. Other people say that low IQ is mediated through school performance, that low IQ people do poorly in school, and because they do poorly in school, they tend to drop out, and being a dropout is a big risk for crime. So it's not low intelligence that is the problem. It's the lack of opportunity or the delinquent peers that you run into when you drop out of school. Some people say there is no relationship between IQ and crime, that it's an illusion, that what happens is, lower IQ criminals are more likely to get caught, right? The smart ones don't get caught. And so there is no relationship. It's very controversial. And you'll read a little bit about this. Another thing that's been discussed is this idea of the notion of self-control, this idea that people have an ability to defer gratification. And some people's ability to defer gratification is better than other people's ability to defer gratification. And to the extent that people can restrain themselves, they're more likely to resist temptation to commit crime. It's tempting sometimes maybe to steal. It's tempting sometimes to lose your temper and to respond aggressively. And so some people are better at restraining that than others, and some criminologists have argued that this is a trait. We do have good evidence that there are some kinds of brain problems that can directly cause criminal activity. And we know that you can change people's brain chemistry and get them to do all kinds of things they wouldn't ordinarily do. So, for instance, there's a drug called Requip that is to treat Parkinson's disease. And one of the side effects that it has is that people who take this drug to control symptoms of Parkinson's disease can develop a pathological gambling addiction, gamble away their rent money, gamble away their 401k. Now that's kind of odd that you treat someone's tremors for Parkinson's disease and you turn them into a compulsive gambler. Well, the regions of the brain, we don't know as much about the brain as we wish we did, but apparently the regions of the brain that cause the tremors of Parkinson's disease are close to or react similar to the regions of the brain that allow you to assess the odds when it comes to buying lottery tickets or playing poker. So here's a drug that can turn someone into a compulsive gambler. People with Tourette syndrome that have a particular form of Tourette syndrome called coprolalia. It's a rare form of Tourette syndrome, and it will cause people to shout out obscene words. And it's not something that's completely under their control. So think of the absolute worst thing you could say, the words that would get you in the most trouble if you were riding on the bus, or you were in the department store, or you were, in line at the grocery store. Think about words that you could blurt out that would just absolutely offend people. And that's what people with coprolalia do. And they have no control. It's not something that they're in control of. It's not their fault that they do it. And what's weird about that is apparently there is some place in the brain where racial epithets, hideous swear words are stored. And there's some sort of wall in your brain that protects you from ever saying those kinds of things, because the consequences would be just so dire, and most of us would never want to say those kinds of things. And yet here you have a psychological condition that obliterates that wall and causes these people to, compels these people to engage in very, very stigmatized antisocial behavior, and there's nothing they can do about it. So to me, that's pretty good evidence that with respect to some of these crimes, the neuroscientists and the biopsychologists have some points that they make that we should probably attend to. So these chronic offenders are probably more likely than others to have problems that need the attention of a psychiatrist. And that would explain, some portion of crime. But remember, altogether, the chronic offenders account for a lot of crime. But in Wolfgang Figlio and Selland's sample, it was only 50%. That leaves the other for 50% unexplained. And for that, we need to look at environment. And look at these graphs and charts from earlier. You'll see that there's no way to explain regional differences in crime, that the West has higher crime rates than New England. That can't be explained by saying that there are more sociopaths in the West. There must be something about the environments in the West or the cities in the West that are more crimogenic than the cities in the East. The same, virtually the same people are alive that were alive 10 years ago when the crime rate was higher. There's no way that you can explain the decline in the crime rate by looking at biology. So for this unit, we're going to look at these biological theories, and then for the rest of the semester, since that's what sociologists do, we're going to take our time going through a variety of environmental theories of crime. So you'll have some background in the demography of crime and in these biological theories, but then we're going to focus on the things that sociologists believe are the best candidates for explaining crime. Now, when we get to these sociological theories, there are certain facts about crime that the theories must contend with. Number one, the theories are going to have to explain why men are more involved in crime than women. They're going to have to explain the age-out phenomenon. They're going to have to explain chronic offending. So that's why it's important for you to have known these things, and that's why we went over them. So enjoy this week the study of the biological theories of crime.